Welcome to our penultimate lesson on migration for this topic. Today's title is How Have Migrants Influenced Britain? So write that down please, and also today's keyword is referendum. So write down the keyword and its definition please. So pause the video and complete those tasks. As normal, a quick connect. So a few of these questions you've already answered on connects before. And the reason they've been repeated is either because a few people got them wrong or because they're really important pieces of information that you need to know. So there's 7 questions. Please do look back at previous videos, look back at previous work that you've done and answer these in full sentences please. So pause the video now and complete that task. So now that you've completed your connect, here are the answers in red. So just go through your answers and correct the ones that you got wrong. And if there's any that you did get wrong, then please just write them in green pen, please, in a full sentence. So in today's lesson, we're going to think about the different ways that migrants have influenced Britain. And in order to do that, we're going to think about some information and put it into 3 categories. Political, where we have a picture of the Houses of Parliament, cultural, where we have a picture of the globe, and economic, where we have a picture of the NHS, which is one of the main providers for jobs in the country. What we're going to do with this information is I'm going to read a big block of text. You're going to write the subtitle above in the top left of the screen in the centre of your page, and it's going to be the centre of your mind map. So how have migrants influenced Britain? Then, as I read the text, you need to listen carefully and then add the information to your mind map in these 3 categories. So political, cultural and economic will form the 3 branches of your mind map. If you need to, you can pause the video at any point. You can rewind the video if you need to, and you shouldn't be copying all of the text that I say word for word. I don't want to see that. Instead, you need to pick out 2 or 3 points for each category and add them to your mind map. 2 or 3 points is the minimum. You are welcome to do a few more points, but please make sure you have at least 2 or 3 points for political, cultural and economic. We're going to start with political. And then when I finish that, I'll pause and give you a bit of time to pause the video and rewind it if you need to. So, political. Britain is run by one of the world's oldest parliaments. The word parliament itself is originally a French word and means speaking. This is because our political systems emerged after the Norman conquest. Many of William's descendants had spoken French, and they even considered themselves to be French. A few years later, when Richard the Lionheart came to the throne, he was often seen as the perfect example of Englishness. But he spoke no English himself, and he actually rarely visited or lived in England. More recently, in 2016, the UK held a referendum on membership to the European Union, where 52% of the country voted to leave the EU. For many people, migration was one of the key reasons for voting to leave, with one poll suggesting that 70% of people wanted limits on people coming into Britain from the European Union. It seems likely that migration will continue to be a source of political controversy. That's our first category, so I'm going to pause briefly and then we will move on to cultural reasons. Cultural ways in which migrants have influenced Britain. One of the biggest changes since the Second World War has been the increased diversity of our country. The 2011 census revealed the number of people defining themselves as white fell from 94% in 1996 to 86% in 2011. The same survey found that Muslims are now the 2nd largest religious group in Britain after Christians, making up 4.8% of the population. Most cities in England now include many different places of worship, from Christian churches to Jewish synagogues and Muslim mosques. Of course, one of the other ways in which we benefit from the impact of migration in a cultural way is through food. Many of us enjoy eating pizza, pasta, curry, Chinese, Thai, Mexican food, and many others. It's hard to believe now that only a few generations ago it was virtually impossible to eat these foods in restaurants or to buy the ingredients in shops. So that's our information for the cultural section of our mind map. So I'll pause, and you can pause the video if you need to before we move on to our final category, economic. Economic ways migrants have influenced Britain. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain experienced an industrial revolution, becoming the first country in the world to build factories on a large scale. The Huguenots, with their experience and expertise in different fields such as textiles, played a really important role in helping Britain start to industrialise. Much of the canals and railways were built by navies, who were mostly Irish migrants. In more recent times, Britain has also relied heavily on migration to help fill the labour shortages created by the Second World War. The NHS, set up in 1948, contains a large number of migrants working at all levels. One study showed that in the years 2004 to 2007, 37.5% of all doctors working in the NHS were foreign-born. So that's all the information. That's the final bit for the economic branch of our mind map. So pause the video, replay anything that you need to, and finish your mind map, please. So hopefully now you've completed your mind map from the previous slide, and using your mind map now, I'd like you to complete the tasks on the right. So the first thing to do is highlight the 3 pieces of information that you think are the most important ways migrants have influenced Britain. They can be from any branch, but 3 things that you think are the most important piece of information that have changed Britain. And then just a sentence or two, why have you chosen those factors above other factors? Why have those changes been more significant, more important than some of the others? Secondly, using your mind map, overall, which area do you think was the biggest influence? Was it political, was it cultural, or was it economic? I'd like you to write a few sentences to a paragraph answering that question. So pause the video now, complete those tasks, and then we'll move on afterwards. Now we're going to do some source work in a second, but first I'm just going to introduce you to this source in particular, and then another source on the next slide, because they might be slightly confusing. Now this source is called Immigration in the Press, the Bar Chart of Shame. And what it does is it shows all the different national newspapers that had put a story about migration for every month of the year 2016. Now the year 2016 was the year where Britain held the Brexit referendum, whether they should stay in the European Union or leave it. And newspapers played quite a big part in that year. And the artist Liz Gerard wanted to highlight that. So what she did was she found all the national newspapers that ran a headline about migration in a kind of negative way. And so throughout January to December, you can see how many national newspapers each day had their national front page plastered with something about migration. And you can see, hopefully, on your bar chart that in May and June we have some of the biggest spikes, particularly in May, which has the most front pages with a negative impression about migration. And Liz Gerard's work was exhibited to the public in an exhibition at the Migration Museum in London. So hopefully you've got a bit more understanding about that. We're going to now move into another source which just zooms in on some of these headlines. So source B is a photo taken by Louis Hollis of the Migration Museum, and it's the same bar chart that we saw, but a little bit closer up, so you can see some of the headlines here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of the headlines, point them out to you. So hopefully you can see that first yellow ring in the bottom right of the screen, and it says migrants cost Britain £17 billion a year. The second one says 500,000 migrants heading to Britain. And the third one is there's a migrant crisis which will cost £20 billion. Now these different newspaper headlines are generally negative. So migrants are costing Britain a lot of money. That's maybe causing people to worry about them or to think of them as coming to take people's jobs. And 500,000 migrants heading to Britain, well, that's suggesting that there's a huge swarm of migrants that are going to be coming across the sea to Britain. So these were just some of the headlines that were published in the year 2016. So now you've got a little bit of explanation about source A. Hopefully you'll be able to answer this first question in the top right of your screen. What have you understood about source A? So go back to the previous two slides if you need to, and just summarise for me what you think this source is all about. The second task to complete is to think about what's the purpose of source A. So why has Liz Gerard made this source, and who has she made it for? So what was the point of her making this? Why did she take the time to put this together? And finally, the referendum was held in June 2016. Does this help to explain the spike, so the peak, of negative headlines around May-June time? Why might there be more negative headlines in the newspapers at that time, just before the referendum's held? So have a think. So 3 tasks there. Do pause the video now and complete those in full sentences, writing a couple of sentences for each question. So here are 3 example answers that you're able to go through. Hopefully you won't have copied these word for word because that wouldn't be useful for anyone. But you've got 3 example answers. What you can do is just compare the answers that you've written to these 3 answers. So take your time, pause the video and just see how you got on there. This also gives you an idea of how much you might have written for each of the 3 questions. Final thing to do, so read these 3 summaries about the influence migrants have had on Britain. Pick the one you agree with most and then have a go at explaining why you have picked that particular summary above the other 2.